This past Friday was International Workers' Day, an annual celebration of the labor movement and the ongoing struggle for workers' rights. And many of you, along with so many others, participated in May Day strong actions or the inactions of no work, no school, no shopping, joining the call to put workers before billionaires. I recommend exploring the May Day Strong website, especially their affordability agenda, policy and resource manual. It's a plan to put the good life for everyone back within reach. If I had to boil down that entire 71-page report, there's a lot of bolding, so you can get through it, down to a single word. It actually wouldn't be one of their policies or their programs. It would be a practice. And tellingly, that one-word practice showed up in the instructions to text one word to a designated number, and that word was solidarity. That same word, solidarity, is also prominently featured in our own Unitarian Universalist Association's current You the Vote campaign, Ignite Solidarity, Reimagine Democracy. Whenever I start to see that word, solidarity, popping up, it gives me hope that an increasing, maybe even critical mass of people is beginning to get it, that we do not have to make it alone through this life. Because solidarity is one of the most powerful words we can reach for when the world feels out of balance. Does it feel out of balance to any of you? It's one of the most powerful words we can reach for when dignity is unevenly distributed, when too many of us are asked to struggle in a system that no one should have to struggle in alone. For many years on Labor Day weekend, we've sung the anthem, Solidarity Forever, in our Sunday service. And it's not an exaggeration to say that solidarity is one of the most powerful and the most necessary commitments that we can make for building the better world that we dream about. If you want to explore that idea more deeply, I recommend the recent book, Solidarity, The Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea. It's by Leah Hunt Hendricks and Astra Taylor, two activist organizers and scholars who have spent years studying how can we come together across our differences to create lasting change. So why does solidarity matter so much right now? Because it is a response to the unequal reality that we find ourselves in that is as stark as it is unsustainable. Why these billionaires think that people aren't sharpening their pitchforks is really beyond me. Actually, they do know because they're all buying up land and building bunkers. We are living in a society where financial insecurity is the norm for many, not the exception. For nearly 3 out of 5 Americans, there is no real financial cushion. A $2,000 emergency, something as ordinary as a car repair or a medical bill, can push too many of our fellow citizens, their families, to the brink. At the same time, not the top 1%, the top 0.1%, a tiny fraction of Americans have steadily increased their share of the nation's wealth, growing from about 10% 2 decades ago to about 16% and increasing today. The broader just top 1% has seen similar growth and hoards about 31% of the country's wealth, just in the top 1%. And over those same decades, executive pay has skyrocketed while workers' wages have barely kept pace. Clear evidence that as productivity rises, the rewards are not being shared, they are being concentrated at the very tippy top. As inequality deepens, what remains for the common good, for the rest of us, shrinks. Opportunities narrow, and many of us are left not cooperating, but competing, scrambling for an increasingly smaller share of the good life. As one historian puts it, we are living with the squalid consequences of liberty without solidarity. We don't just want freedom from, we want, what are we going to do with our freedom? What is our freedom for? If that diagnosis is right, then solidarity is not optional, it is essential because the task before us is nothing less than building a society where everyone can live with dignity and where our way of life does not come at the expense of our planet. But that better world will not emerge on its own. It will require us to resist the forces that divide us, challenge systems that exploit people and planet, and to rebuild institutions that are too often bent toward private gain instead of the common good. It will require us to remember that we belong to one another. At its deepest level, solidarity asks us to rethink something that we often take for granted: who we are. Are we primarily isolated individuals, self-made, self-sufficient, standing alone? Or are we, as that top pedal on our UU values remind us, fundamentally interdependent? Dr. King put it this way: in a real sense, all of life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until each of you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That, King said, is the interrelated structure of reality. And solidarity is what it looks like when we take that interdependence seriously. In our UU tradition, we call this covenant. If you look on the back of your order of service, it's our UU values and covenant. Freely choosing mutual trust and support, not because we have to, but because we choose to. Solidarity is what covenant looks like when it takes economic and political form. Solidarity is our love at the center made public, love becoming organized, love refusing to remain private. The truth is that long before any of us ever made an independent choice, we were born into dependence, into families, communities, ecosystems, histories. Solidarity begins with recognizing that interdependence is not a weakness to overcome, it is a truth about reality to honor, and that our rights are inseparable from our responsibilities. To say more, I want to share some insights from a short and inspiring book, Equality, What It Means and Why It Matters, by Thomas Piketty and Michael Sandel, a leading economist of inequality and a renowned political philosopher, who together explore what a just society might require of us. Now, if we're honest, it's pretty easy to feel discouraged about solidarity in our current moment. Over the past few decades, so basically right where you start to see it going up, that's Reagan is elected, and we begin neoliberalism. So from the Reagan era through today, we have seen rising inequality, growing polarization, and a cultural shift that increasingly celebrates only individual success while downplaying our obligations to one another. In many ways, it can feel like the forces of division have the upper hand. And yet, if we step back and take the longer view, there are reasons for hope, really. Because the broader arc of history tells a different story. Just look even at those middle decades in the chart when inequality in this country was far lower than it is today. Again and again, movements towards greater equality have emerged, not automatically, not without struggle, never easily, but through we the people coming together to demand access to what we now recognize as fundamental goods: education, healthcare, the right to vote, and the ability to participate fully for everyone in the life of our society. From the French and American revolutions to the abolition of slavery to the rise of labor movements and the expansion of suffrage to the long struggle for civil rights, progress has come when we, the people, have organized, mobilized, and insisted that dignity is not the privilege of the few, it is the birthright of all. And even in our own time, despite all of the heartbreaking setbacks, there is a growing awareness that people everywhere deserve not just survival, but dignity, participation, and voice. So yes, the levels of inequality we face today are real, but they are not unprecedented. Just look over at the other side of the chart from the previous Gilded Age. In many ways, they were even worse a century or two ago, which means something crucial. The battles we are facing, they are not new, and more importantly, they are not unwinnable. They have been fought before, they have been won before. We must win them again. And that matters because especially this week, as we have been reminded how fragile those gains can be with the devastating news from the Supreme Court finishing the work of gutting the Voting Rights Act. It is something that John Roberts has been dreaming about. It's nothing he's wanted more for decades. And finally, his wish has come true. But as the UUA's Side with Love response reminds us, when people organized for civil rights in the middle of the 20th century, they did not have the courts on their side. They didn't have Congress on their side. They didn't have public opinion on their side, but they showed up. So we have no other option but to show up again through our actions. So may we recommit ourselves to the long, faithful work of ensuring that democracy belongs to absolutely every one of we, the people. And I want to invite you to consider another example of how dramatically a society can change. Take Sweden. Just over a century ago, it was shockingly less egalitarian than it is today. Until World War I, Sweden limited voting to the wealthiest 20% of men. The wealthiest 20% of men. And you got more votes the richer you were. And in some places, one rich individual held so much voting power, this is in a few different spots, that one person effectively could decide the vote alone. A little bit like all the money flowing into elections from these rich billionaires after Citizens United. And yet, within the span of a few decades, through labor movements, political organizing, and the rise of social democratic leadership, everything shifted in Sweden. Workers, many from mines and factories, came to hold real political power, and with that shift came a new vision of what government could be. I think people are glimpsing some of this with Mamdani. You're seeing some excitement around that. Actually, government, we can have nice things. And instead of reinforcing inequality, the state was used to expand opportunity, implementing progressive taxation, investing in public education for all, and building systems designed not for profit alone, but for the common good, for all of us. What that story reveals is something crucial. Inequality is not inevitable. The way a society is structured, it is not fixed by culture or by destiny. It is shaped by who has power. Who do we let have power? And what do they do with it? And history shows us that when ordinary people organize, when we claim our voices, when we act in solidarity, even systems that once seemed immovable can be transformed. To bring that closer to our own time, consider the example of modern Denmark. As Bernie Sanders has noted, in Denmark, social policy in areas like healthcare, childcare, education, protecting the unemployed are part of a solidarity system that makes sure that no one falls into economic despair. Danes pay very high taxes, but in return, they enjoy a quality of life that many Americans would find very hard to believe. It's actually possible because it's already happening in many other countries. Notice what's being named there: a solidarity system, a society organized so no one is left to struggle alone, and everyone has a real chance to live with dignity. We've been trained to hear in America, almost reflexively, "It's my money. I earned it." But solidarity asks us to interrupt that story because no fortune, no matter how brilliant or hardworking the individual, is created in isolation. Every success depends on roads that someone else paved, schools someone else funded, laws someone else enforced, and the labor of workers who made it possible, unless they replace us with robots, but that is another sermon coming in the fall. And once we see that, everything shifts. The question is no longer, what am I allowed to keep? But what do we owe one another? What do we owe one another? Because if wealth is co-created, then responsibility is shared. If our lives are interdependent, then our ethics must be too. Solidarity is the practice of telling the truth about our interdependence and letting that truth reshape how we live, how we give, and the world that we seek to build together. And if solidarity tells the truth about how wealth is created, it also tells the truth about how value is assigned and how it is misassigned. Because the problem isn't only that gap between the gap between the top and the bottom has grown so vast. The problem is that we've come to treat that gap as if it was somehow deserved, natural, even inevitable. When a hedge fund manager earns thousands of times more than a teacher, a nurse, or an electrician, that is not an economic imbalance. It is a moral message. It says implicitly but powerfully, this kind of work deserves far more reward, and this kind of work deserves far, far less. That is not unfair. It is an insult, and it should be named and taken as such. You should be angry. You should sharpen your pitchforks. But before we ask how high the ceiling should be, solidarity insists that we raise the floor, not just survival, but dignity for everyone whose labor sustains our shared life. Solidarity means not too far apart. Not in income, not in opportunity, not in dignity. And this is where solidarity becomes concrete, not just a feeling, but a value and a system. Because if we are serious about believing in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, then we cannot ignore the scale of the inequality gap. It's one thing to say some people should earn more based on skill and responsibility. I believe that. But it is another thing entirely when the difference becomes so vast, 50 to 1, 100 to 1, 200 to 1. Then we are no longer talking about reward, we are talking about power over others. That's why thinkers like Thomas Piketty push us to imagine something far more compressed would be fair. Something like 1 to 5. We can go 1 to 10 between the lowest and highest incomes. Not total equality, but a boundary and a moral horizon. Because beyond a certain point, inequality stops being about incentives and it starts being about domination. When a CEO makes 5 times more than the lowest paid worker in their company, that difference can reflect responsibility and role. But when they make 100 times more, that is not a difference, it is a distortion. And notice what happens when the gap shrinks. You can no longer casually buy someone else's time in the same way. You can't so easily insulate yourself from the realities that others face. Distance narrows, not just economically, but socially, relationally, I would even say spiritually. Solidarity becomes more than an aspiration. It becomes the air that we can breathe again together. So yes, we talk about minimum wages, but solidarity also demands that we talk about maximum wages, about progressive taxation not as punishment, but as a way of keeping the social fabric from being torn apart. Like pollution, extreme inequality doesn't just sit there harmlessly, it corrodes. It is corroding everything around it. And if we want a society where dignity is widely shared, we have to be willing to say not too low, but also not too high. Now, all of this can sound big, structural, overwhelming. So the natural question is, what would this actually look like in practice? Not to turn this into a policy lecture, but to show what solidarity looks like in concrete terms. My top recommendation is, well, if we eat just one billionaire, I think the rest will fall in line. More seriously, there are already ideas on the table, policies aimed not just at raising revenue, but reshaping the moral structure of our economy. I'll limit myself to 2 representative examples. First, there's what's being called the overpaid CEO tax. And if that sounds bad to you, I refer you back to the first slide. It's like, but the idea is simple. When companies pay their CEOs vast vastly more than their workers, they should pay a higher tax rate, not just to raise revenue, but to incentivize a different set of choices. Raising worker pay, narrowing the gap, moving us closer to that not too far apart vision of solidarity. Second, there are proposals for a billionaire wealth tax to address the concentration of power at the very top. And the underlying concern is exactly what we've been naming. If we don't act, we risk drifting into a world where a tiny number of people hold not just extraordinary wealth, but extraordinary power over the rest of us. And right now they're proposing just a one-time tax, but I think it should be again and again and again until there are no more billionaires. That seems pretty clear to me. I'd cap it at 100 million, but that's... Anyway, these proposals point in a direction toward a society where we don't just tolerate inequality, but we actually set limits on it. You can't live on 100 million. Come on. Anyway, we need to set limits for the sake of dignity, democracy, and the common good. And this brings us back to something deeper than policy. The frame that we talk about this matters so much, because one of the quiet failures in recent decades is that too often the language of patriotism, of belonging, of shared identity has been ceded to the right, as if those words of patriotism can only mean exclusion and suspicion of outsiders and narrow nationalism. But solidarity has always had its own language of love of country, of love of place, of love for a people, of love for a life that we can build together, not just alone. The question isn't whether we talk about belonging and love of country, it's how we define those things. What if patriotism means not just pride, but responsibility for this country? Not just waving a flag, but asking, what do we owe one another because we are bound together in this place? What if we said clearly that benefiting from a society carries obligations to sustain it? That paying taxes and investing in public goods are not burdens, but expressions of love for this country and for our fellow citizens? What if we came to see that when corporations shift profits offshore, when individuals treat society as something to extract from rather than ever contribute to, that is not cleverness, that is unpatriotic? When we come to see that, everything will change. It's taking from the very community that made your success possible and giving nothing back. This vision of what I'm talking about, it is as American as we the people. It is as deep in our country's DNA as e pluribus unum, out of many, one, which was our country's motto until the 1950s when we changed it to In God We Trust. As I near my conclusion, I want to bring in one final book whose 4-word title names what this moment may be asking of us. When we are confronted by the stark inequality of our time and by the possibility of a better future, solidarity does not just comfort us, it calls us. The title of this book is Let This Radicalize You. Organizing in the Revolution of Reciprocal Care by organizers and movement thinkers Kelly Hayes and Mariame Bacaba. And by radicalize, they don't just mean becoming more extreme, they mean getting to the root of what is actually causing our problems and allowing that truth to move us into deeper care, deeper connection, and collective action. This book reminds us that we need to end with hope, not a naive hope, not the kind that ignores how very hard this moment is, but a hope that someday people will look back on our times like these, and see this moment as a turning point. A moment when we were still divided, when we were still unsure how to live together, when we were still telling our stories of separation and individualism, but also beginning to remember something again, just beginning to find each other again. And I hope my 2-year-old son will find himself someday living in a world where solidarity is not something we have to fight for, but just something we simply live. Where we recognize that our lives are bound up with one another, not just across lines of class or nations, but bound up with one another and the earth itself. Because in the end, that is what everyone thriving looks like. Not rugged individualism, but deep mutual belonging. And since that world is not here yet, since we are not the ones looking back, we are the ones still living through the struggle, I hope we choose to be the people who build that better world that future generations deserve. I hope that we resist the slow drift toward numbness, refuse to accept suffering and cruelty as normal, inequality as inevitable, and division as permanent. I hope we keep feeling what is so hard to keep feeling. Keep caring when it is so much easier not to. Keep showing up for one another even when the path forward is unclear. Because the truth is, the work before us, it is not new. It is the same work that we humans have always been called to in times of crisis, to build worlds worth living in as the old ones falter. And that work doesn't begin in grand gestures or sweeping policies. It begins in something much more ordinary and much more powerful. It begins in relationships, in care, in choosing solidarity over isolation again and again. So yes, the work is big, but it begins here and now. It begins with us. It begins with the simple, radical act of remembering that we are in this together. And if that's true, if we really are in this together, then let's begin practicing it here and now. Rise and body or spirit. Let's sing together, Solidarity Forever. So I know I haven't recommended enough books this morning, so I want to give you two more. Because really what I've been thinking about these, I read a lot of books and a lot of them are important but relatively forgettable, and two I've never forgotten about. And if I weren't already teaching this comparing religions class, and maybe we'll do this after I do the comparing religions class, but two books by Richard Rorty, who I think is easily one of the most important 20th century American philosophers from the pragmatist tradition. If you're a big philosophy nerd like me, I recommend his book Contingency, Irony, Solidarity. Or you could just read that final piece of the book, but that is nerdy and philosophical, but a major landmark book. The more accessible book, and the one that I think it's only one of his books available as an audiobook, is called Achieving Our Country. And it gets to a lot of what we've been talking about this morning. So I recommend that book by Richard Rorty as well, Achieving Our Country. So as we continue into the rest of this day and into the week to come, continue your journey with love at the center. We can't control all the chaos around us, but we can control what we can control. Continue your journey with love at the center. Care for one another. Care for this one earth. Do justice and make peace. And as you go, whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of even just a little more hope or love or peace or joy, that goes with you out into the world, because we are different for having spent this time together. And even in this very hard time in history, continue to look for and savor all that still remains good and true and beautiful. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.